enemy within. Putin and Russia are the enemy. Traitor, treason. These are some of the words and the phrases that have been bandied about and contribute to a dangerous environment for the survival of dissident thought, where right now Russiagate can be used in order to discredit not just the collaboration between Putin and the far right, but the assumption that those on the left of the political spectrum, anyone outside the hallowed centre, must be suspect. Anyone who wishes to introduce a nuanced argument into the debate is dismissed as someone who must have a link to Putin or is slightly more sympathetic to his values or to his geopolitical aims. This is dangerous in a world in which nuance, fact-finding, and the expression of discourse, fair and balanced, must hold sway. An infamous article in Slate suggested that Putin and the Russians are exacerbating the racial divide in the US. It's true that there are links between the far right and certain nationalist groups, especially those linked back to Russia, Russian chauvinism, etc. But the idea that the Russians are responsible for up to 300 to 400 years of racial discrimination in the US and Europe is ludicrous. As Abraham Lincoln said, this house will fall because it's divided and divided amongst itself. Democracy will fall because of the flaws within itself at home, not because of the wishes of any foreign power. I think we should pay heed to those words.
It's always this story of the evil man. This is basically how international politics is explained to the stupid. It's an evil man out there and he has to be killed, and when he's dead, everything is fine. And it's a very stupid story, because basically international politics is about access to oil, to gas, to resources. It's about the extensions of military alliance like NATO. It's about regime change. It's about opening up markets so you can import. It's about, it's about money.
My overarching principle when proposing a policy to deal with Putin is that of starving the beast. Starving the beast in terms of attention, but also the opportunity for Putin to acquire prestige in the eyes of the Russian people through presenting himself as the resistor against Western actions. That should be the guiding principle when thinking about responding and having any conversation around Russia, Putin, and security issues around Eastern and Central Europe. And it's important that Western politicians, policy analysts, and journalists are careful that their ramping up of rhetoric against Russia does not impact the geopolitical situation in West Asia, that we don't see consequences that may lead to the allowance for war and increased hostilities within a region which is already a tinderbox between regional rivals. An unintended consequence of renewed and exacerbated tensions with Russia would be the effect it has on the geopolitical situation in West Asia. Iran and Russia are ostensibly allies, not really in terms of any deep friendship, but they see themselves as geopolitical and strategic allies pushing back against American influence and Saudi influence, as well as Israeli actions within the region. One of the dangers of this rhetoric, the ramping up of rhetoric and calls for actions against Russia, is the consequences it would have for all-out war when it comes to the American desire to see Iran punished for its growth of influence in the region post the Iraq War. This ramping up of pressure on Russia could have an effect on international agreements such as the Iran deal. The Cold War is often cited by many people who want to discuss Putin's relationship with the West. The ex-KGB officer is cited as the great Bond villain who has the ability to foresee and warp Western influence and to preempt Western actions. But what's important is something that we forgot from the Cold War period, is that many of the politicians actually understood the risk of nuclear war, the risk of an exacerbated conflict, what the pressures and responsibilities were when attacks happened in many countries. It's important that we make sure that the lines of dialogue are open, that we actually understand the Russian perspective, not because we want to promote Russian interests, no, because it's important to know your enemy. If your perspective is that Russia is the implacable enemy of the West and the implacable enemy of democracy, we need to begin to understand Putin's mind and also the mentality of many Russian people who aren't particularly interested in increased tension with the West. They simply have a notion of their own dignity, their own pride, and what they require the Russian government to do in terms of pushing forward Russian interests. Tensions have always been present when it comes to Anglo-Russian relations. They were there pre-Soviet times. One only has to go back to a long list of events from the period between the formation of Tsarist Russia right to its calamitous end to look at tensions that have existed between the British state and the Russian state, a la Crimean War, for example. Right through to the Soviet period, from the invasion and intervention in the Russian Civil War to the collapse of the Soviet Union, tensions have always been present. But what statesmen have understood is the importance of making sure that these tensions are reduced, that messages are sent, but not in grandiose ways that are reckless. Many people criticised certain political figures such as leader of the opposition Jeremy Corbyn for not being firmer enough. But what we don't need is not necessarily adolescent rhetoric. What we need is decided policy solutions. We're also going to see the increase of sanctions on Russia, Russian individuals and companies. There may even be the follow-through of a threat to revoke the license of RT, which has been cited as a propaganda channel by the UK government. Now, all these actions, in some people's eyes, might send a strong message to Putin. Or it could simply increase the bunker mentality which is so natural in Russia. The idea of Russians gaining dignity from resisting the West. Russia finding its place in the world by resisting Western influence and pressure, and Putin milking that for all it's worth. Whatever happens, the national debate, either in the UK or the US, or on the continent in Europe, has to be more nuanced and has to be more intelligent. This isn't about merely showing force and showing Putin who's boss. This is about effective policy. We need to start having that conversation. Scriptural affair will not lead to World War III. But what it will lead to is really a fast forwarding of things that are already in place and already going to happen, which is the increase of a British military presence on the Polish, Estonian and Russian border, an increase in cooperation, military, intelligence and otherwise, between the Baltic states and the UK. But Russiagate, as well as the Scriptural affair and the exacerbation of tensions, is also about the idea of the West having a moral mission. The West democracy is under threat, but its greatest threats lie within its own house, within the system. Gross inequality, the fact that economic stability has been taken away from ordinary people. Democracy has been watered down through gerrymandering in the US, or the fact that elections are purchased. And of course, Putin is pushing at these already open wounds, and many of them self-inflicted wounds. The West feels that it has to have a new moral mission in order to arrest the decline of a unipolar world and the emergence of a multipolar world where Russia and China are reasserting themselves all across the globe, from West Asia right across to the Far East. But this idea of a moral mission means that we overlook any degree of self-reflection and self-critique, the ability to strengthen the Western Hemisphere through looking inwards and seeing the self-inflicted wounds and trying to mend them. It also stops us thinking about constructive ways in which we can actually defend democracy. It's not about engineering a new Cold War. It's about thinking about our cyber warfare investment, but it's also thinking about the effects of money on our electoral system, public education, the ideological sway and makeup of our political parties and the political spectrum, the quality of public education when it comes to politics, as well as the political debate within our countries. Substantive debate and allowing dissident ideas to flourish, to renew democracy in the West. These are the strongest weapons we have in defending our rights and democracy. One thing's for certain, Putin relies on tension. It's very useful for this tension between Russia and the West to be nurtured and exacerbated, especially considering that Putin can use it in terms of strengthening his position within the Russian political system, but also within his own power base. He can position himself as the father of all the Russians, as the leader of the resurgence against the imposition of Western values, and the redeemer of Russia against the humiliation that it suffered during the 90s and after the Cold War. It's critical that Western politicians, analysts, thinkers and journalists don't play into this idea to help Putin pose himself to his own people as the defender of Russian values or a distinct sense of Russianness against Western encroachment. This has already been violated when we think about NATO's and the West's broken promises in terms of NATO expansion after 1990. Right now, especially with this scriptural affair, we need to think of really clear-headed attempts to breach the divide between Russia and the West that doesn't lead to exacerbation.